Do 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 do. Extras.
It's time for the final extras of the Tales from My D&D Campaign original series, as opposed to Sea of Secrets, which I'm working hard on as we speak. And don't forget, the SOS version of these extra videos is called Secrets of Sea of Secrets. But as for the climactic TDDC episode 66, I knew for some time exactly how I wanted to start this episode. Opening on the wordless previously with the epic boss theme that I had been judiciously saving for this, virtually never reusing it after the scene it was originally made for in episode 40. No matter how epic the opponent, in order to preserve the music's power for this battle. Showing the damaged headless horseman being sucked back into the cloud, then the entire cloud being sucked in, as the nightmare re-emerged with green lightning replacing the fires, with the ball lightning double weapon replacing the flaming hell chains dropping down to either side, and finally that iconic asshole demigod's head rising to fill the void between those big armored shoulders. I love the mental image so much, and though it took a lot of work, did a pretty good job of capturing it, despite just lazily recoloring the mane, because making a proper animated lightning mane would have been even more work. Seriously, when making a mostly still image show, do not create a boss with freaking 3 different elements that have to be animated even when standing still. The nightmare mane, the ball lightning, and the permanently flowing cloak. Actually, the cloak is a lazy animation using shape tweens, an automated function in Adobe Animate, which usually gives a terrible result. Like if you aren't careful, morphing a square into a rectangle might have it go through some twisted MC Escher shit in the middle, instead of just lengthening one side like you'd expect. But that jankiness actually worked fine for a monocolor fabric on an Eldritch Fear being. Now, the wordless, ominous cold open into the TDDC intro was great. Even though there was a lot of previously I actually had to explain ASAP after the intro. Then, of course, reuse the boss reveal animation, both because the narration is valuable and important for vision-impaired viewers, and, of course, to reuse the animation because it took so long to make. I had been planning all that for a very long time, of course. LittleOne was obviously going to look surprised, which looks a lot like worried for a moment, then turn that into yes! I think that was always going to happen, but at some point between playing the game and making the episode, Thor Ragnarok came out, which provided a famous pop culture moment that fit so well that I knew I had to quasi-rotoscope LittleOne onto Thor's cheering reaction from the trailers. I say quasi-rotoscope because real rotoscoping would be too much like actual drawing. This was closely mapped to the real video, but still mostly puppeted via my regular flash animation techniques. Either way, I find it hilarious just because, again, if Ragnarok never existed, I would have done something very similar. It's just a natural dramatization of LittleOne's reaction both in and out of character. But the MCU version just made it that little bit funnier by giving me a perfect scene to mimic. Thor was even wearing a vaguely similar helmet. This was not a fight I was sure they would win. Certainly not one I expected them all to survive, but we were going on hiatus for a while, I thought, and I wanted to go out with a very memorable bang, so while I tried to very roughly estimate how much attrition they would suffer from the boss rush seen in episode 65, I also took into account their artificer-fueled defenses, almost full magic item slots, etc., their high damage per round, and their best attackers' extreme to hit bonuses, and tried to create a threat which definitely might kill some or all of them, but which I figured they could probably beat. Maybe. As so often happens, my notes, spread at the time between a mix of Gmail drafts, Evernote, one other database website, and the occasional bit of physical paper for some stupid reason, have a lot of information, but are missing certain key details. Like, for example, a full stat block for Nightmare Knight Albtraum. But here's what I can tell you. The physical form taken by Al, using their Headless Horseman phantasm as a base, and fueled with all the remaining power of Draven's Astral Plague storage crystal, the demigod's personality fragment, and whatever they had siphoned off the White Spirit Seed, had armor class 41 and 400 hit points, with permanent true seeing, of course. Though immune to electricity, negative energy, and mind-affecting spells, they didn't have much in the way of passive defenses, apart from that rather frightening armor class. Instead, the Albtraum, ever confident, relied on active defenses and sheer destructive might to bring a swift end to these irritating mortals. They had a 15-foot threatening reach with their ball lightning weapon, and 3 legendary actions per round, a 5th edition mechanic to help certain powerful monsters combat the action economy, where they are often outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1. At the end of each opponent's turn, the creature can choose to spend a legendary action to use one of these special powers, often to respond to that opponent's attack. In Albtraum's case, they could spend 1 legendary action to knock opponents back with a shockwave, like Gozer in Ghostbusters, or to attempt to fear a target, Will Negates, or spend 2 of their 3 legendaries for the round to try to petrify a creature, Fortitude Negates, as we saw with Higgins. Meanwhile, on their own turn, Al had 3 times per day quickened Greater Dispelling, which was strong enough to blow away Wall of Force, normally immune to Dispel, yet somehow only managed to knock 2 rounds off the effect of the Rahjs Fate Matrix buff. Al's suite of I'm a demigod actions included a free level 3 Lightning Bolt spell, caster level 10, emanating from the target square for every melee attack that hits, an upgraded lightning-based version of the Headless Horseman's Salamander charge maneuver, which leaves a temporary wall of lightning along the line of the charge, which in Al's case is a very long charge with unlimited changes of direction. Demigod Lightning Assault, allowing them to make 1 attack at their highest bonus against every target within a 50-foot square, though without the free regular lightning bolts they cast on each normal melee hit. A spell which functions like the level 6 Chain Lightning, except dealing a total of 24d6 damage to the primary target, half lightning and half negative energy, with each secondary bolt dealing half as much damage rounded down. And the 9th level spell Weird, which I felt was an excellent opening, for both portraying the seriousness of the fight, and yet having a pretty low chance of killing more than 1 person, assuming they had called in their favor from the Rahjs. A level 9 area death spell obviously screams, "Oh shit!" but with the extra benefit that it's an illusion plus fear spell, perfectly on brand for our nightmare demigod. Oh, and Al was allowed to deal 1d6 electrical damage as a free action once per round, basically wherever and however they felt like, just to be a dick. Speaking of lightning, I removed it from the episode's long script because it had nearly 0 effect on the fight, but when Albtraum deals electrical damage, any electrical resistance of the target is halved. So whenever he hit LittleOne, who inherited 5 points of electric resistance from his mother's side, instead of reducing the damage by 5, it would only have been reduced by 2. As you can imagine, with the crazy numbers being thrown around, that extra 3 damage here and there didn't have a huge effect. But the reason I gave the demigod some ability to blow past resistance is because once again, I expected Draven to see that ball lightning weapon and cast mass resist electricity on the party. Now, a number of Al's moves were part lightning, part negative energy, with a little physical on the weapon attacks. But regardless, giving the entire party 30 points of electrical resistance, that's per attack, not even per round, would have made the fight a lot less dangerous. I didn't want to ignore all resistance, because it's kind of lame if a player does a big cool thing that seems like a wise response, only to have it not count at all, but cutting the resistance from 30 down to 15 would help keep up Al's damage output, while still being well worth the action and the spell slot, if Draven had cast it, which he didn't. So Albtraum opened the fight by unleashing the Weird spell, the oddly named max-level spell which is effectively an area version of Phantasmal Killer, an illusion death spell that kills you not by snuffing your life force, like through necromancy, not by incinerating you, like through evocation, but by instilling such fear into you that your mind just fails. Since only LittleOne failed his first save, I didn't have to come up with a vision for each player this time, and for as much tension as there was on all these saving throws, there was a lot of tension. You may be disappointed to hear that I didn't really come up with the ominous vision for him at the time. That was added for the video because almost dying from a demigod's mighty mind-affecting spell felt like it warranted a more cinematic treatment. I think Al was getting at something real about LittleOne's hubris and maybe a real fear, a real awareness deep down that there may be enemies out there, even flesh and blood ones, who just cannot be defeated by his strength and skill alone. But the Albtraum clearly overplayed that fear and underestimated LittleOne's willpower. And let's face it, it was also a fun opportunity for me to give a little glimpse of the super monitors that have loomed in the background of the series since that early exposition dump. But yes, Deathmoor can fly. Yes, he has an attack he calls automatic captions, please do not transcribe, in which he drops a tornado on you, kicks the crap out of you on the way up, then finishes you with a vicious lightning strike kick down. And yes, he used the word penultimate correctly, because this is, at most, his second biggest attack. If you were a fan of shonen anime power systems, though, you might watch this brief clip of an event that hasn't happened and extrapolate that maybe creating and sustaining a bunch of multiforms to run around and fight separately may not be the optimal usage of that much-feared technique. Especially since actual multiforms are almost certainly not as insane as the version Albtraum created for Nightmare Zokuno back within their realm. I did put a lot of work into this part. It took some real thinking to figure out how to make the rotating winds look okay without spending way too much time on them. And I did get to reuse some big chunks of Deathmoor Vasali's downward kick animation, which helped. But overall, despite all the compromises I made to get it out, this is one of those segments that shows how cinematically I imagine shit when I see it in my head. I feel like the end could have been implemented much more strongly by better animators, but I still got across the idea of seeing LittleOne falling, strobing back and forth between the real world of the lab and the basilica, and the nightmare vision in which he was, in his mind, dying. Then we show him pulling out of it with a dramatic shot of his foot catching him, skidding to a stop on the ground, as he managed to resist that lethal despair. Now the second vision, Krillidin's, did actually get brief mention at the table just because of how the went, and Krillidin's joking about the Homer Simpson Cobras Night Terrors gag, even though he did make the will save. I mean, thematically, as the spell washes over them, everybody would be faced by a horrific vision, but if they made the first save, they successfully see through it, see that it's an illusion, and don't allow the false reality to be forced upon them. And Krillidin's vision was from his past, a nightmarish version of a real event he went through where his previous military unit, before he was transferred to the Eladrin Scouting Corps, all got petrified by Formians, with Krillidin being the only survivor. That's the thing I do with Formians. They don't have an ability to turn people to stone in the monster manual, but they are specifically immune to petrification. So, when I bring in Formians on their home turf, I have them set up magical or alchemical petrification traps wherever they can, because their effect is devastating, and the Formians are immune to it. Also, Weird is a powerful spell. Like, fail both saves you die, fail even this first one and you get stunned, and take strength damage, weakening victims in a way that takes longer to heal. But I still find it hilarious that it does like 3d6 hit point damage on top. It's such a strange little addition, though I guess it helps the spell to kill, I don't know, regular peasants who get caught in it, but somehow lucked out and passed the level 9 spell's will save. As usual, there was a bunch of stuff that happened in the battle which I couldn't quite reconcile. Most of it probably made sense when looking at the actual battle map, but without taking pictures every round like a real smart person planning to make a video might do, it gets messy. In a weird battle with high stakes, there were also some mistakes I and the players made, which sometimes I include in the battles, but I often change them because our errors can make the events of the fight way more confusing and illogical, and some of those fourth-dimensional shenanigans can really get in the way of weaving a clear and satisfying narrative. Though it makes me a little sad to cut out any instance of the Albtraum's cheating. One example is this, which I believe happened during the indestructible Black Cloud phase, before Al took their Nightmare Knight form. Well, then I'm gonna hit him with Dimensional Anchor. Or I could use a much higher level spell, Dimensional Lock. That one does a whole area. I don't want that, because I want to be able to get out. So, Dimensional Anchor. Roll for spell resistance. Weird. It didn't SR anything else. 29? Your ray gets deflected back, but narrowly misses you, hitting the wall behind you. Wow! That would have been so much more fun. Some version of spell turning? He's got asshole abilities. I'm going to Belt of Battle and maximize Orb of Force, spending 5 charges, or no. Nothing really seems to be damaging him. Draven did go ahead and Orb of Force for 1 charge, but then we realized he wasn't actually wearing his Belt of Battle after his turn in the chair. He just had the Breastplate of the Master, plus his backpack. The magic backpack was full of stuff, which he could pull out and use quickly, but it would have taken a move action to pull it out of the bag, then a standard action to equip it, then he could have used the belt to gain a standard and a move action. Anyway, obviously it was less confusing to cut one of the 2 actions, since only one could have happened, though I suppose neither of them really did anything to the amorphous cloud of evil, so which one to keep was fairly arbitrary. Other than that, there were a ton of the usual little details I had to try to tidy up or otherwise reconcile, especially since, in hindsight, I'm pretty sure when I drew the room on the actual dry erase battle map, in person, I must have made it bigger, 50 by 50, even though my notes had specified 40 by 40. So the 40 by 40 room in the video took a lot of adjustment. This mostly resulted in some repositioning of people around attacks of opportunity when fighting Beta, Mort, and the others, and a lot of fudging people's positions around the very end of the final battle to deal with Albtraum's long reach and the lightning bolts, line nukes, sent out whenever he made a regular melee attack. Not that he did that too often, and he did not get the free bolts on Henshin no Raigeki. I have tried to figure it out, but like Draven, I have no idea where in the Shadowfell they found the vial of emergency random dimension door dust. It's definitely an item that I made up. It works very similar to the limited use magic belt Kaiser used to escape the party. Still, Draven was definitely in the worst position for the giant fight, having been the one in the chair and therefore having most of his gear not equipped. And equipping stuff in combat time takes an unfortunate amount of actions. Though at least he had armor on. That's the thing which takes minutes instead of 1 action or move action. Still, because of his artificing, all the PCs, especially Draven, basically have a magic item for every slot, which is about a dozen. And putting on 2, maybe fudge it to 3 with haste, items per turn, while doing nothing else, that would take a long time, and a lot of being a target. Obviously he didn't need everything, but all his stat boosting items and his of resistance item all seem pretty essential, and even that would have taken another couple turns, all with a rampaging demigod apparently prioritizing him. So you can see why he wanted to nope out. That said, once he did get the space he needed to equip some gear and cast some buffs, his desire to ask Black via sending whether it was safe to return, that was never going to work out. Sending takes minutes to cast. Despite all this though, from my point of view as GM, not being in most of the fight made me worry, because until right near the very end, the whole battle seemed dicey to me. The heroes kept suffering attrition at what felt like a faster rate than Al, because the demigod's hit points were 1 giant block, whereas his multi-target or area attacks were constantly threatening to take out the more fragile members of the party. Krillidin, Mora, and to a lesser extent, Angel. and all while their fate matrix buff was ticking down, decreasing the chance of the Albtraum missing them, and their chance of hitting the Nightmare Knight. In that context, I was pretty worried that Draven's absence, one fewer person trying with a chance to get hits in, and one fewer target for any non-area attacks, that they'd hit that fatal tipping point where a couple of them drop, and they no longer have the DPS to win. And that's what it really looked like around when Krillidin got feared. Higgins' one move, the one thing she actually did, other than force Al to spend a couple legendary actions to petrify her, with that force wall, made a pretty big difference, because it saved them all about 40 damage saved for half, and twice that much for the primary target of the modified Chain Lightning. But it really came down to Albtraum not charging or teleporting all around the room for a couple rounds, allowing the heavy melee characters to full attack. They finally got some good rolls, and did a large percentage of Al's hit points in quite a short space of time to finish the job, despite the bonus from the Rahjs being virtually gone. When it came to Draven's actual plan, other than the sending to see if the fight's going okay part, I like all the paranoid thought going into it. You might ask, why does he dim door outside in order to cast Tree Stride if he's just going to teleport anyway? But remember, my house rule gives actual teleport a cast time of 1 minute instead of one action. So you can use these other spells to gain distance, and that will probably get you away from most enemies. But if you want to go anywhere in the world, you need to be so far or so hidden that those enemies don't interrupt you. And Draven was understandably worried about being chased down, somehow, by the demigod who could Shinninazuma! But as far as Plan GTFO goes, I have to love any plan which, after explaining for 30 seconds, goes, then, after a couple years... Plus, I really liked that he brought back up that first Legend of the Smith from the beginning of the campaign. You might have guessed that was a later addition from me to tie things together. Nope, that was contemporaneous, part of what Draven's player was scheming while everybody else was fighting for their lives. So good. But the plan never had to be implemented because the rest of the team solved the problem. By smashing. After the main events of this episode, after defeating the Albtraum in the Basilica, I put the campaign on hiatus. I was burnt out creatively between my job, programming for an office, my hobby, which making TDDC videos was, at the time, and GMing. I blamed this mainly on trying to run a high-level 3.5 edition game, so my solution was to start a new, lower-level campaign in the same world, what would become Sea of Secrets. However, I was thinking about, eventually, running further adventures for the TDDC party, and I really liked the idea of giving each character a 1 to 2 session adventure of their own, where the other players could run some NPCs, either existing ones or random new ones who might be fun. And we did, eventually, run a couple of these. Once I, surprise surprise, got kind of burnt out on the SOS campaign as well. Unfortunately, the way things worked out IRL, some of these ideas would never come to pass. The 5 ideas, without a lot of spoilers, were hinted at with the bittersweet pseudo-epilogues at the end of this episode. The hiatus left so many Vistria plot threads hanging, and Black's solo quest was certainly not going to resolve all of them. Maybe not really tie up any of them, but it was going to advance a lot of those threads. The Hand Gauntlet split and the looming threats of civil war, and see how that connected, maybe narrow down who is responsible, for the situation with the Princess of Verandi and the youngest Prince of Vistria. Finding Jonason is a pretty tough ask, but the situation with the prince was a special kind of awkward. From what I understand, that kind of ambiguous kidnapping by relatives has been a surprisingly frequent thing in world history for basically the entire period when humanity has been building castles. Heirs of nobles travel around for a variety of reasons: to make connections with other nobles, to learn about the world, to be safer from ongoing conflicts, etc. And they often stay with loosely related people who may or may not turn out to be trustworthy, especially when they happen to have one of your heirs in their castle. So the question Are they kidnapped? Or has their visit just been extended for reasons beyond anyone's control? Is not always that easy to answer. And that's the situation of Prince Eridan, who the Separatists were claiming was on their side. Meanwhile, the princess and only child of the king in exile of Verandi, who was more of a preteen, had been speaking publicly in favor of the Separatists, and seemed to have decided that her father and the, more powerful, king of Vistria were not acting in the best interest of her theoretical subjects, the descendants of all the people who fled Verandi during the invasion. All a great mess to untangle. In addition to Black, one player would have got to control his dad, Black Sr., and then I would have had to come up with another couple NPCs for players to temporarily control. Possibly another member of the Hand, probably not Higgins, but maybe Victoria DeWall, or maybe a couple whole new characters from the north of the country with different agendas. Most of them probably not as powerful as Black, but the idea was to be a fun change for the other players. Just 1 or 2 nights per solo adventure, and that they'd each have their own turn to be the main protagonist for a bit. Unfortunately, because of the falling out between Briarstone, Black's player, and the rest of the group, this adventure's never going to happen, or at least not in this form. Reginald Black, the character, is still out there working on it though, so who knows how it could fold back in if we get going again. In a certain sense, being forced to stick around and follow the group by the Astral Plague was a very unnatural state for Angel, though her dependence on the White Spirit Seed was painfully reinforced during the No Malone incident in Polaron. The party were a bigger, noisier group than she was really comfortable in, and though they had done a lot of good work, she also felt like she had done far too little in her personal war against the Diluvians. Too little for the organization. Sure, they may only have kept intact over the centuries because of the mercenary elements, but she still wanted to avenge her master, still believed in the ideological core that had started the movement, of causing enough damage to force the evil Diluvians out of the land they occupied. So when she received word that her contacts had located General Lun Su again, Angel, finally free of her dependence on the seed, saw a chance to take him out. And you can't deny how tempting it is for her to assassinate a target who had survived several concerted attempts. Lun Su had developed a sinister reputation as a strategist, but his ability to dodge the organization, that part was particularly unexpected for a member of the Diluvian regular army, however high-ranking. Unfortunately, Angel's player has also drifted away. Not really a falling out of the same kind. I don't think there were any hard feelings, but the guy did kind of slide off the grid, becoming harder to contact over time until we just didn't hear from him again. Which I suppose is the most Angel thing he could have done. It does mean that in-universe, Angel and Mora are going to have to handle the General on their own. Although, this quest was supposed to involve another member of the organization, another assassin out in the field, tipping Angel off as to some other goings-on which might affect the campaign after all these solo side quests. So, if we did get going again, it may be Angel who points the other heroes in a new direction. As the late addition to the party, Krillidin has the least attachment to the others, to Vistria, and honestly the least story, at least that has come up yet. Mostly, after his crummy posting with the Scouting Corps, then his terrible experiences in the Shadowfell, he'd really just like to go home to Oras, the Eladrin lands in the Feywild, despite the lukewarm reception he can expect when he gets there. The problem is, getting back home through the Fadelands would require quite a long trip through the North Pass and Korstrad to the Elven lands to avoid the still occupied 2/3 of Verandi, or worse, the orc-filled desert of Uruk. And even if he could get back to the Feywild somehow without crossing through the old woods in Talaris, he'd be faced with a similar problem, with the middle of the continent blocked off by the massive trenchworks of the Formians. So when he bumped into Tula in the city, initially just helping her out as you'd help anyone who fell down or who was trying to carry too much stuff, as soon as he found out that she was heading back to the Fey, in a flying machine. He thought he'd hit that jackpot. There was a chance that her glider could help him get over or around the Formian territory more easily, especially if, as she'd said, some kind of cataclysm had dropped out of the face sky, impacting the ant-like horde. The controllable NPCs for the other players in this one, a bunch of randos in a Feywild, would be a lot of fun. Unfortunately... nothing, actually. Sorry, force of habit. We actually did play this one at one point, so it'll probably be a video someday. Everyone else, arguably with the exception of Krillidin, had organizations, places, people to whom they had connections and obligations. But with all of them heading off to deal with those things, LittleOne, a half-dragon orphan with no real home or nation, was kind of adrift. Fortunately, Chrysanthemum von Christoph had set herself on a mission of sorts, and she, randomly, found and recruited LittleOne to help. I mean, she's heading into orc territory, so obviously the famous Orc Slayer would be a good person to bring, and it's definitely not that she was somewhat curious about this strange heroic dude who she was reminded of weeks after they first met on the road to Castle, when the gift from him arrived. Not any gift, but a powerful and practical magic ring of arming. The beautiful and capable daughter and presumed heir of a duke, she'd received a lot of gifts, probably some worth even more than the admittedly expensive ring, but your typical extremely rich guy isn't giving out fancy magic items, and also can't take on 3 orcs at once. Not even in a fight. This is the other one that we actually did play, giving out Dwarf Daggerface and even Rainbow Dash to players to control, as they delved deeper into orc culture than even Cece had actually planned to. While Black was going to get involved with some of those Vistria threads to the north, a little ways south, I was going to have Draven involved in some of the Diluvian peace treaty stuff, and other consequences of the repatriation and subsequent recolonization of that big chunk of Verandi, including his ancestral lands. Now, before getting into solo quest adventure section like the others, my plan had been to start off with some play-by-email back and forths to determine how things were going in Draven's re-established province of Rowan. I know how much his player, Quill18, enjoys city builder, empire management sort of games, so my plan was to create a few special stats to represent the population, economy, development, and defense of his fiefdom, and present him with events he could make decisions about, hoping to determine how things went, deciding whether to focus on recruiting farmers, or building towers or golems for defense, how to handle the Ankeg population, etc. Unfortunately, the play-by-email section never quite got off the ground. Partly because Quill kind of felt that Draven had, to an extent, run out of motivation to do our sort of adventuring. In a sense, it seemed out of character for the cautious, now clinically immortal, but still quite killable, Lord to go back to dungeon crawling. His player kind of felt it was time to let Draven retire to NPC status, where he could continue his high-level artificing research and start to have a greater influence, political or more behind the scenes, on the affairs of the 2 nations he was sworn to serve and protect. So, if and when we got back to adventuring, his plan was to bring in a new character who was more motivated to explore the world and fight the various evils directly. Perhaps a character with not quite so much to lose as his now immortal predecessor. My amazing Patreon patrons get extras videos, or from now on, secrets of Sea of Secrets, about a week early, giving them a chance to ask questions, many of which I answer as best I can without spoilers, and then read in silly voices for the public video on YouTube. Like these. Willful G asked, "What other bosses had you considered putting in Dr. Wily's castle? Obviously, some of the bigger bosses, like the Strategic Withdrawal Unit or Gamma, would have probably been too big for the arena, but there were still plenty of foes that I could see making an appearance, like Dell or the Grisgall." I didn't want to answer this question between episodes 65 and 66, because I wanted to keep everyone guessing about the final boss, and if I started ruling out choices, I was worried it would make it more likely people would figure out Al takes physical form, or possibly even that it would involve the, thus far unimpressive, Headless Horseman who had just been sucked back into the cloud. As you say, the strategic withdrawal unit was too big and frankly too tough, and Gamma not a whole lot better. Plus, those fights were partly based around their environment, so any version here would kind of feel like a nerfed version. Also, Gamma didn't feel like a real OMG, somebody nearly died sort of threat, which was the main theme I tried to stick to, give or take the lumberjack. Del was closer. He gave Draven a pretty hard time, and the bastard killed TR4, but part of his threat was from allies, then from being a multi-phase fight. Actually using the DA's body-swapping abilities wouldn't really fit my vision for the Nightmare duplicate phantasms, and besides, I was definitely bringing back Beta, and I think sticking to just one Dark Ancient was probably better for variety's sake. The first monitor they fought, in Corso's Chasm, annoyed the hell out of LittleOne with constant stuns, but he wasn't really that memorable a fight for them, and the two Deathfins Albtraum hit them with were both too recent and too powerful. Doing a boss rush creates a certain amount of attrition, damage adding up against the party and making them expend resources, and when the plan is to hit them with a powerful final boss at the end, that only gives me a certain budget for how much crap I can attack them with and still give them a fair shot at the boss. Also, I was pretty sure, maybe a little too confident to be honest, that the party would call in the Rahjs for this and get that Fate Matrix buff. But I wasn't sure how early they would be willing to cash that in. They could easily have fought through a few waves, maybe all the way to the final boss, before realizing, oh shit, this is serious. And if they did not have the buff as successive enemies got stronger, Mortival and Beta might have survived a couple rounds longer, and everything together could have done a reasonable chunk more damage than they ultimately ended up doing. Anyway, what I'm saying is, Deathfin Zokuno or Vasili would have taken up too much of that budget, as would something like a Vampire King. Plus, if Al could make anything even resembling a convincing Vampire King when not even in his realm, that doesn't feel right to me, and I don't want to cheapen them with a half-assed version. The Grizzgull would be interesting. I'm not sure I remembered that one, it's such a weird monster rules-wise, but it could have been fairly dangerous without going overboard, assuming I kept its one spell of each spell level the same. Having them fight Balvon would feel weird, similar to the Lumberjack, except that was a pretty minor enemy at this level, so I just threw it in anyway. Kaiser, with Victor from the start, would have been solid, especially since they'd be unlikely to blow such huge resources on him under these circumstances, but given he didn't even hit them before sacrificing things to escape, Al couldn't possibly see him as an appropriate nightmare to fight them with. Wormy would have been a good choice. I could easily have used him, though a little on the larger side. But beyond that, you get into weirder niche choices, things that were never a credible threat, or things the party had never really come close to facing, like a dragon or whatever, which would definitely not fit the theme very well. So my choices were definitely not the only options, but I feel they were pretty good. And yeah, the really big threats that come to mind, which I didn't use, were mostly too physically large and or would have dealt and absorbed too much damage, considering how hard I plan to go with Albtraum's physical form. Rinsaku Blade asked, during the credits, we see that Asmodeus is not happy with his little minion. What happened to the Albtraum? Did they get destroyed? Or demoted to some kind of lesser being? What happens to the Dark Place in the Shadowfell? And actually, that raises a good question. Is there a good-aligned version of the Albtraum's domain somewhere? Perhaps a hallowed wood looked after by a powerful angel? Al was not destroyed, however displeased Asmodeus might have been. Al definitely suffered some punishment, along with a severe loss of face among the community of astral beings, with some corresponding loss of power. Asmodeus still weights the Albtraum's usefulness as greater than their incompetence. But Al's realm will be diminished in some ways. Not that you would notice if you were so unfortunate as to wind up inside. But the efforts that the demigod had put into extending their reach to grab the party from miles away down in the underpass, that reach has been knocked back to nearly zero. You'd have to practically touch the tree line, the visible boundary of the dark place, to become trapped and railroaded in, without being offered a choice. The Albtraum will have to go back to the old ways of manifesting themselves as a spirit or traveler beyond their borders, and working to convince, bribe, or trick mortals into entering and facing their challenges. Unless a surprising amount of suckers wander by in the near future, it could be at least a couple centuries before Al can get back to being able to physically obstruct paths on the surface to subtly lead travelers in. And a very, very long time, even if Al has a good run, before they can even think about reaching down into the tunnels of the underpass again. As for whether there is a good version of the Albtraum's realm, a heavenly equivalent of that so-called outpost of the Hells, it's possible. There could be an angelic demigod operating some unnaturally safe haven, or maybe even a trap where evil is punished. But even if there is such a place, it's probably nowhere near as large or as powerful as Al's nightmare realm, because it is the nature of evil to lust and to scheme and to claw endlessly for more power, whereas a force of good is likely to give more than it takes, to feed others more than it consumes, and even if it is a force of vengeance, a force bent on destroying evils, if it is really capital G good, like elemental good, then presumably its nature would be to seek justice, not conquest or plunder. And there's not a lot of profit in real, fair justice. So the entity running such an outpost of the heavens could only grow as big and powerful as the Albtraum if a great many, and or some greatly powerful, allies were willing to give of themselves as much as Al has been able to take from others over millennia. Ultralight asked,
"Did Draven ever get the astral plague out of him? The procedure was aborted halfway through, and we never got confirmation whether his immortality would have interfered with it."
Draven reduced his levels of astral energy a lot, but he did not succeed in curing his astral plague because of what happened during his own procedure. What he does about that now is up in the air. It's unknown whether his immortality actually prevents him from curing it in some way, separate from the events/explosions that happened in the Basilica, but he has the knowledge now to figure it out. He knows how to complete the standard cure, and if the immortality is a bigger factor than he originally thought, he probably has the ability to compensate for that too. But he has also mused about using that knowledge to find a way to utilize the plague energy in some way, now that he believes he knows what is possible. Tom Johnson asked, "After the Albtraum killed Andrew Midgarde, did he stay dead? I mean, the party are definitely capable of raising him, and I presume his family can easily afford the necessary materials for the basic raised dead. Or did the Albtraum's attacks have some property that prevented resurrection magic from working?" Sadly, Andrew is almost certainly staying dead. The real reason is that after the resurrection Black performed in Polaron, I reconsidered things, and the rule is now that Raise Dead, Resurrection, etc. are no longer regular spells on some spell list that you can just cast. Going forward, I decided not long after that event, bringing the dead back to life will always require some kind of a heroic quest, probably a different one every time, which still requires a cleric, or fully prepared including the other costs spell scroll, but only after you've researched some special method or component or fey bullshit or demonic bargain or whatever, and done some amazing shit to get it. Though that raises another level of uncertainty for poor Andrew. See, in the Deathfin setting, demons and devils are very rare in the physical planes, Shadowfell, Fadelands, and Feywild. But if you do run into one, they have a terrible power. If such a fiend kills you, your soul does not pass go, you go directly to the hells. The question is that specifically an ability of regular demons and devils who somehow get out to terrorize the living, or is that a power of all servants of their boss, Asmodeus? Rahjs made it clear that if you died in the realm of the Albtraum, your soul belonged to the demigod, who is a wholly owned subsidiary of Asmodeus. But I don't think anybody knows for sure whether that would apply to kills scored by Al out in the real world. All their regular rules don't apply out here, so it's a little unclear just what would happen to Draven's intern's afterlife. The sad fact is, I don't suspect that bringing back the young Baron is a major priority for our currently separated heroes. So, unless immortal NPC Draven feels so guilty as to attempt it himself off-screen, poor Midgarde hath snuffed it for the foreseeable future. Oh, and his father, Count Midgarde? He's not super thrilled. Sygax asked,
If one of the characters, like LittleOne or Black, was actually a Dragonborn, how would it have changed? Would there have been a heavier dragon threat and dragon lore implications? Or would it have been basically the same?
I'm not sure that a PC being a Dragonborn would inherently have changed things, looking back at the way the campaign all played out. But that's only because it depends so much on the specific character, their backstory, and how their player role-played the situation. Because a player being a Drac, as we're calling him in future videos, for IP paranoia reasons, could have changed a ton of things. First, one assumes that a Drac living on the continent would have a negative opinion of the powerful, godlike species who created his people only to be their servants. But 50 years after the tragic end of the Freeborn Rebellion, you could be a Dragonborn who actually dreams of meeting a dragon, who is enthralled by their power and glory. I mean, for a magically created species, that reverence might be bred into them to some degree. So you can imagine it feeling right for a child or grandchild of those survivors, who is too young to have seen the short-lived nation called Freeborn, nor the horrors of the Reconquest and of Lady Paragos's Death Knights. And whether they loved dragons or hated them, this Drac PC would almost have to have an opinion. Role-playing-wise, that ought to have an impact on their relationship with LittleOne. His mother despised slavery and had no part in the repression of the Dragonborn. But this Drac PC wouldn't psychically know that. And as far as the NPCs, some people don't like Dracs. Visually, they really stand out, and many people find them big and scary looking, especially since they are known to have a breath weapon. Plus, some other people in areas that have more of them, mostly certain ports on the east coast of the continent where most of the survivors of the rebellion landed, would see them as refugees. We all know how certain people look at refugees in real life, and those are all fellow members of the same species, without huge jaws or the ability to breathe acid or whatever. Take all that, and then this Drac runs into LittleOne, who is literally half dragon, but can totally blend in with the humans. One might be jealous of that. But then they run into the Dragonborn Death Knight. Those things wiped out most of the Drac's people, which is a way different perspective than LittleOne had. Lady Myelana and her loyal Drac servants would all have certain reactions to the Drac PC, whether that character was pro-dragon or anti-dragon. LittleOne's player did have some real interest in messing around with the dragons, and whatever they're up to, he still does, especially with Albtraum's prophetic, or possibly bullshit, vision looming over them. But dragon stuff was always one of the many plot hooks, some of which felt a little, or a lot, more urgent. If we had both the half-dragon and a Drac PC, that math might have changed though, and of course, I might have brought in other elements, which is really hard to predict because I, much like I assume you do, tend to look back at how the campaign actually went, and it makes it hard to see what I might have done differently beyond single decisions, as all the little changes would have accumulated. Grim Reaper asked, similar to the above question, what would have happened if a player was a Warforged, especially during the Dark Ancient parts of the campaign? Similar to the above, it would depend on the specific PC, their background, personality, attitude, blah blah blah. Are they a big dumb chonky fighter type, or a bookish mage, or one built for some specific non-combat profession who somehow fell into this adventuring party? That said, there are certain far more concrete implications of how the Etaran-related adventures would have been changed by having a mech player character, as we're calling them now due to IP blah blah blah. First, Dark Ancients have a literal save-or-die ability against a mech PC, which the villains are heavily incentivized to use because jumping from body to body is how they survive. So the second Dark Ancients came up in any way in the campaign, they would have been painted as an absolutely terrifying, nightmarish thing. Because they really are, from the perspective of a mechanical being who is vulnerable to their invasive, mind-destroying power. Now, I'm not going to rob that of its power by making the PC immune to it. But on the other hand, I'd have to address it somehow because I usually don't like using such an easy, instant death ability in anything other than big, epic, built-up encounters. Especially when it only applies to one specific PC. That feels kind of not great. So there probably would have been some quest within Ginneron, or maybe before, searching for some kind of magic item to protect them from these terrifying evil things. And, by the way, could we still have done the Temple 1 thing? Sure. Epsilon wasn't hiding out to swap bodies with the first rando to come along. They were looking for help to get to the controller. So that wouldn't have changed, even if the party were, hopefully not too obviously, looking for an item that could grant +10 saving throws against Dark Ancients. But there could have been tons of story opportunities depending on whether the mech PC did or did not remember anything about their time during the Etaran era, before being put into suspended animation, then later uncovered and reactivated. Those memories, or even their absence, could be role-played in interesting ways when encountering ancient Etaran facilities. That could have opened up new and different plot hooks relating to that stuff, or to some of the things in the Shadowfell. The PCs weren't really in the same areas where the Dead Wars were mostly fought, but they could have been. That's the conflict the mechs were originally forged for, and where countless of them died. But like most things, it comes back to the players, the specific characters they make, and how they want to RP them. Grim Reaper also asked, it was hinted in the Shadowfell episodes that the Rahjs had dealings with the Vampire Kings. Or Cornello, anyway. Was that just fluff for the videos, or something that was in the background for the campaign? Also, might the Rahjs have any further impact on the epilogue games? A lot of groups do a lot of scheming that is behind the scenes, which either doesn't come up in the player's adventures or in the videos, or may not really affect them at all. The Rahjs knew their enemies, the Mindhunters, had backed Swain, and also Mortival, though it's unclear whether Swain even knew about that. It might have been a separate deal. So they definitely had some dealings with Cornello, because his nation and capital are so close that he was the most likely victim if Swain's Mindhunter backing were to help him expand. In their grand chessboard, realpolitik worldview, they needed a strong Cornello, at least in the short term, to prevent, or at least delay, whatever their enemies had in mind. But they also knew the TDDC party might not react super well to that idea, to aiding a vampire king, especially with Black, Zaheer, and Rahjs around. You want to know how the Rahjs roll? Swain had captured the Worm Shrine, the main spirit shackle used to grant Wormy his form. So the Rahjs provided Cornello with some assistance to take it back, and once he did, and appointed a new Wormy, the Rahjs provided them with the information that assisted their scheme beneath the streets of Castle, a ritual which Cornello hoped to eventually use to infiltrate Swain's citadel, Old House, via the Fadelands. But knowing there was a real chance of the PCs becoming involved, the Rahjs did not share that information with Wormy. But they did convince him to do everything overtly, blatantly, in Cornello's name, so that, if something happened, it would look like a false flag operation being run by Swain. It was, after all, an area corresponding to Swain's own territory. That's how convoluted their scheming can get, and that's what allows them to use selective information to create or imply the narrative they want, using only true facts, like Wormy is normally one of Cornello's lieutenants, but that shackle has changed hands recently, planting the idea that this whole Cornello cult may have been too obvious, too in-your-face to be real. Unfortunately, after the PCs destroyed Cornello's Wormy, Swain's forces recaptured that shackle, leading to the post-credits scene in episode 54. Now, the Rahjs didn't really play a role in the individual hero side quests, at least not as far as I had planned. But would they play a part if or when we get the main campaign going again? Almost certainly. Then Grim Reaper asked, what would have happened if one of the PCs tried to romance one of the Rahjs? Say, if one of them took an interest in Lady Hazamura. Do these Rakshasas have any interest in romance or affection of that sort? The guys weren't playing, nor was I running, a very romance-themed game, as evidenced by how insanely long it took for anything at all to maybe result from LittleOne's interest in Cece. But even if we were, or do in the future, I think all of the Rahjs are asexual, and may also be aromantic. They have gone pretty far to purge themselves of most of the traits associated with their demonic heritage, including hedonism, because it all interferes with their pursuit of knowledge and control. If there is a way to romance Lady Hazamura, it would be one of those Doctor Strange gazes beyond time, and out of 14,605 possible futures, in how many was she romanced? 1. Though, to be fair, if you put it to her that way, and had the evidence to back it up, maybe she's into that. Philip asked, what was the rare event that was so unlikely, so disruptive, that the Rahjs were forced to reboot their fate matrix? I don't want to get too deep into that, just in case, but I will tell you that it's related to the impact in the Feywild which has the Formians so stirred up. Krillidin's solo quest probably won't provide a lot of answers, but what he finds there is definitely another side effect of the same event. Though, given that it caused a mountain to fall on the Formians, I suppose we can extrapolate that whatever it was must have happened somewhere up in the Fey sky. Rex asked, what is Beta doing now that Epsilon's plan has failed, and, as far as we know, most or all of the other Dark Ancients died with him? While clearly none of the Dark Ancients were paragons of empathy, of them all, Beta was perhaps the most cool-headed, and though it agreed with Epsilon's plan, like, if it could press a button to kill all the mortals whom Mataru seemed to favor, Beta would push that button. But out of Beta, Delta, and Epsilon, Beta was the least invested in that plan. Beta's #1 priority was survival, and also its number 2 through 5, with revenge ranking somewhere below that on its to-do list. Gamma, of course, was as much a killer as any of them, but was suggestible enough that it's hard to ascribe a whole lot of agency to their actions. Gamma had figured out that Epsilon and the others were much smarter, and they had all agreed to work together rather than compete for the slowly dwindling supply of appropriate bodies, and so the ever-growing swarm mostly went along with what the others wanted to do, as long as it was provided with enough mechs to continue growing and living through the centuries. But when Beta lost the fight against the party, it did not keep trying after running out of optimal combat-ready bodies. It accepted the outcome, retreated to its small, buried contingency body, and patiently waited out the party. When, after feeling the rise and then decline of the massive astral energy buildup at the pole, Beta tried to contact each of the others in turn, and, after trying again a week later just for confirmation, it accepted the outcome and adjusted its plans to proceed through eternity alone. If anything, it will be more cautious now. Would Beta love to exterminate the heroes who defeated it and who, it presumes, killed the other Dark Ancients? Sure. If it could press a button to kill them, it would. But whatever Beta is doing now, the one thing that is certain is it would not attempt to confront our heroes again unless something were to radically change. Rex also asked, what is the story that led Baron Woodbridge to become Baron Deathmoor? It's not a super deep story. Baron Woodbridge, who is so important I don't think I ever made up his first name, was a very ambitious man, and in his youth he believed he would run his barony so well that the King of Vistria would recognize it and promote him to Count of all Midgarde. Soon, he learned that things don't really work that way. Historically, almost the only way a baron gets promoted to Count is if the previous Count committed treason or managed some other screw-up of that magnitude, and so he changed tacts, trying instead to enact Machiavellian schemes to bring down Count Midgarde. Except he was not, in fact, an epic schemer, and after a decade of trying, his liege lord remained, and Woodbridge's main, not inconsiderable, accomplishment was that his failed schemes, and that one assassin, were never traced back to him. Thwarted in his ambitions, Woodbridge wasn't getting any younger. Desperate to find some way to gain control of his life, and apparently unable to see how good he had it with the lifestyle of an average baron, he hired some unsavory users of magic to try to find some potion or ritual or lost magic item that could help him to gain the power he sought. As they delved deeper and deeper into the pursuit of dark knowledge and necromancy, one of his experts offered to put him in touch with someone who could grant him everything he ever wanted, though the cost might be dreadful. And I think we can all see where this was going. That is the man who traded most of his barony's population for the promise of power over life and death. Bessie asked,
What are Polaron controllers' goals, other than protecting the facility? Why is it letting Draven command its golems outside in the epilogue? And what is GE7 up to?
Polaron Controller had nothing to do for a very long time, patrolling empty halls and bridges against non-existent threats. Then, in the blink of an eye, from the perspective of a millennia-old intellect, it was suddenly besieged by a dangerous entity it could not pin down, could only detect indirectly, which was constantly corrupting its workers' hardware. Then, a small elite force started brute forcing their way in from the surface, crushing everything in their path. Yada yada yada, the strategic withdrawal unit gets stolen, the facility was almost destroyed in a gross violation of controllers' ecological protocols, a potentially hostile dragon infiltrated deep into the facility, but after that brief period of existential threats and madness, for the first time in ages, science is happening there again. That's what Polaron exists for, well, and military engineering. The new occupants studied the Eye of Ashur, formulated a procedure and recharged it from the volcanic ley line, and then they requisitioned the photon accelerator to battle the ancient enemy, the Vampire Kings, in the Shadowfell. That last part may have been the most Baldur's Gate 3 chose the right conversation option event in the campaign. But between all those things and many, many hours of discussing history, the Dark Ancients, and the state of the world outside with GE7, the controller has more stimulation and more purpose than it has had in centuries. So when, after defeating Albtraum, Draven retreats there to focus more on research and preparing for future threats, Polaron controller is primed and ready. And those golems in the secondary armory, the special, independently powered ones capable of operating outside the facility, it's true that those are partly to enable the controller to respond to a hypothetical threat which might try to attack the facility in some manner that takes advantage of the limited range of the cheaper facility-dependent golems. Like the Magitech version of some kind of long-range artillery bombardment. But they are also intended to function as an expeditionary force, if there's a good reason. And if Draven, as the new director of the facility, is doing research and developing new Magitech, the controller is going to give him a fair amount of leeway, because that was how the creators tended to work best, when they were allowed to pursue their intuition and their crazy hypotheses. Especially if he's using less than half the force within the Arctic Circle on the same plane of existence. If he wants to go beyond that, they're going to have a debate. As for GE7, he has a lot of empathy for the controllers. They have a hell of a lot in common, being locked away for centuries after the deaths of everyone they knew, bound by their sense of duty, except that he, having legs and such, has now had almost a year in which to travel across Tark to visit the Elven lands, etc. Not nearly enough freedom or travel to make up for centuries of seclusion, but he felt a responsibility to keep Polaron company when the party left. Now Draven's back, though, and even when he isn't, he's going to be giving the controller experiments to monitor or other tasks. And GE7 is itching to go out and travel again. There's just so much more worlds to see. Where he will go, he has some ideas, but I doubt even he knows where he'll end up. Bessie also asked, "Do mechs have souls in Deathfin?" The Atarans used those principles of magic, that it's easier for a magic item to simulate a function that it can physically emulate, or at least if it almost works without the magic, to make the Warforged, especially the most humanoid ones, as efficiently as possible. But the real magic of the creation forges, their real genius, was how they created sentience, and the way they did that was by creating artificial souls. In fact, the Atarans at the time often referred to this type of mechs as soul-forged, a soul-forged warrior, soul-forged transmuter, etc. So, do this type of mechs have souls? Technically, if you had a binary detect soul spell, it would almost certainly give a yes. If that spell rated souls on more of a spectrum, you might get fuzzier results, and some of the less humanoid mechs, or some with more robotic personality or lack thereof, might barely register. They are vulnerable to death spells, many of which function by attacking the soul directly. And the Dark Ancients, as terrible as they are, manage to survive as a form of cohesive mental energy apart from their bodies. if that's not a soul, that just raises more questions about what a soul exactly is. The real question becomes, what are the implications of synthetic souls? What happens to them when they die? Is it the same as regular souls, which drift across the astral sea to either the heavens or the hells? Unless something goes wrong, the kind of thing Anku's shepherds get involved with. Are there supposed to be a certain number of souls in the universe, and these ones are in addition? Where do natural souls come from? It's a whole giant philosophical and metaphysical kettle of worms, and not very easy to test or research in-universe. Xylem asked,
The scene with the Darktree is one of my favorite scenes in all of TDDC. Can you tell us more about the prophecy and the spirit seed? Is it supposed to grow into a new sun deity for the Shadowfell?
Legend has it that it's supposed to wipe away the clouds and haze that obscure the sun, moon, and stars above the ceiling. Would it remove the ceiling? Seems unlikely, because physics. That would mess up the symmetry between the Shadowfell and the Feywild. Could it become a new sun deity? I don't know what happens to Rahjs then, but it's not the worst theory. Ultimately, though, in the meta sense, this is the kind of legend which adds another mythical layer to the setting and is probably better less explained rather than more. Much like that incident with the Tall One. Xylem and Philip asked,
Can you confirm or deny that Dwarf Daggerface is a dragon shaman who gets his powers from LittleOne? How is DDF seemingly immune to the astral plague?
Well, we know DDF is a dragon shaman. I think it's pretty clear that he is drawn somehow to LittleOne, almost certainly because of his draconic nature. However, DDF does not get his powers, or his inexplicable ability to survive the astral plague, from LittleOne. Whatever affected the dwarf once known as Supervisor Huevo, it was something that happened within that dark and terrible cave in the Shadowfell. Hopefully, someday, the Deathfin cinematic universe gets far enough that we can learn the secrets behind Daggerface. Both Daggerfaces. Xylem also asked,
Another loose thread. What is Zaheer up to following the end of TDDC? And are you still in contact with his player?
Zaheer is off doing shepherd stuff for a while. Might that interact with Black's quest in the north? Probably not. Could I have forced it, making him and Mahar NPCs if we had played out that adventure, even though Anku stuff doesn't fit the themes? Definite possibility. I am not in touch with the player, but Quill could probably get in touch with him. Might be in touch with him for all I know. I wonder what he thinks about the videos. Then Xylem asked,
And of course, another loose thread is Seven, Draven's rogue homunculus. What's up with it?
Seven survived, left Polaron into the Arctic wastes, somehow ended up crossing over to the Fae, was observed to be spying on some Formians, and refused to elaborate. Does it have a new master? Or did it develop its own motivation? And now that Draven has some free time, will he track Seven down to find out? Who knows? Further, Xylem asked,
Oh, and a final piece of loose major NPC thread. What's Liz doing these days? Did she join LittleOne on his orc quest? Did Draven assassinate her for knowing too much? Is she dating GE7?
Well, when we last saw Liz, she was taken in by the hand as the new arms trainer at the Basilica. But you'll be pleased to know, when LittleOne was tasked with escorting the future Duchess of Newland into orc territory, he thought of Liz too, and had Rainbow Dash swing by and pick her up. It would be unfair to say Liz hates her current job, but she's hardly excited by the prospect of getting up every day and trying to teach a bunch of mostly flimsy, mostly humans to fight without hurting them too much. Given a choice, she jumped at the chance, though they hid her under a cloak till they got out of town, just to avoid any extra complications, because the people of New Vaniver still aren't ready for the idea of a non-enemy orc hanging around town. And that, of course, made her one of the temporary PCs for LittleOne's solo side quest. Slumbery Storm asked,
You've said the Sea of Secrets campaign also hits a hiatus at some point. Are you planning to play more games in this setting? Or do you have yet another one you've run after SOS?
I'd love to get the TDDC game going again, to reach a more satisfying conclusion to at least one of the big issues the players and characters care about in the world. But obviously things would change a lot, with 2 players and 1 character rotating out, and maybe 1 new player in. And while I have some strong general ideas, I seem to have a hard time working on the specifics, because I've put way too much self-imposed pressure on a continuation of that hallowed campaign. I think I need to throw together and run something first, with lower stakes and a good chance it dies after a couple sessions, to get back in the groove, and also get used to the GM side of Roll20 or whatever VTT has a shared map grid for combat, even though I'd much rather theater of mind most parts of the game. And no, I don't have any other long-running campaigns lined up for after SOS. I tried one weird improv-based game which I recorded, but it didn't continue far enough to make a series. I have been a player in some games, the best of which so far I am gradually making into the Hammer and Smoke podcast. There are currently 5 episodes up on patreon.com/Demonac, kind of like an audio-only TDDC series, which I do plan to release to the public someday, but only when I've completed the whole season with about 5 more episodes, so that I can try out a release schedule. Those scripts will take a fair amount of time to write, though, and it's a lower priority than SOS. So I expect it'll be Patreon only for at least the next year. With the TDDC campaign having been on hiatus for a lot of years at this point, this will be the last video about it for a while, though I will get around to those couple of side story videos eventually, for Krillidin's and LittleOne's tales. But for now, I'm focused on Sea of Secrets, aka TDDC 2, as well as a few things I'm working on slowly on Patreon, like the Hammer and Smoke campaign podcast, which is high-quality storytelling, kind of like a TDDC show without visuals, as well as the new Demonac is Boring casual podcast, also for patrons, which is more of a conversational thing where each episode I talk about one little thing going on in my life and one other thing I've been thinking about. The first episode was Aspartame and Lancer RPG. If you don't want to send me money on Patreon, you can still follow me now on Shitter, Threads, Blue Sky, hell, even TikTok. Not that I feel like spending any time making shitty short vertical videos, but you can follow me there in case I start. Most of those places will help you to not miss new videos, since YouTube's so bad at notifying. Since my usernames are inconsistent across all the sites, you can easily find any of my socials by visiting demonac.com/name of site, all lowercase. For example, demonac.com/discord, or demonac.com/bluesky will redirect you to my profile. Also, if you wanted to scour the internet for any random stuff I've posted on Tumblr, or for my unlisted story video about dragon politics in the world of TDDC, I've compiled as much of that non-Patreon stuff as I can in a Google Doc at demonac.com/free. That's the free stuff tab of what is otherwise my patron rewards document. But as we cap out this particular loose end for the original Tales from My D&D campaign, I of course have to thank all the patrons, past and present, from the first 2 who pledged, Kurt Yost and Randomize, to the family who didn't want any commitments but PayPal'd me money once a year, to a few anonymous people who have supported me massively over the years but didn't want to be named in the credits. Thank you to all of you who have made it possible to reach this point in my creative journey, and to those who continue helping me to tell even more stories into the future with the best quality that I can deliver for you. And with a profound and special thanks to
Administrator Orange, Aether Mordu, Alberio, Oust, Aurelius, Bedimir, Bessie, Captain Rook, Brethren, Karnlin, Critical Hit 20, Darkwood, Dimmin, Dragonloot, Draugr, Earl of Sanguine, Eckerdeer Thalion, Fey Crossroads, Fireborn, Gator Island, Fright Knight, Gorefiend, General M.O., 9, Hakoon, Lieutenant Red, Lonito, Lord Aben, Malison Desh, Matt the Mage, Mars Project, MG3D, Norgrin, OI1, Olden Man, Overlord Thor, Hadric of Rooney, Pontus, Quackers, Ramar Ulfist, Repmok, Rex, Rewoot, Skyder97, Stan the Man, Starfall, Sygax, Tambu and June, Toshiro7, Volkfang, Valis, WA Soul, Warsaw, Woodley, and Zombie, the members of the organization. Feywild.